Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Williams, and for today's notes, we are going to be covering the details of aquatic pollution. You should have already finished the intro to aquatic and terrestrial pollution notes. This is the next part of the notes that you'll find in your Unit 8 notes packet. So let's go ahead and get started. The first topic today should actually be very familiar. We have covered this multiple times this year when we've talked about agriculture, when we've talked about soils and nutrients in soils that allow plants to grow. So what we're going to do today is apply how nutrients affect aquatic pollution. And you guys actually know this already. It's eutrophication. So this part should be pretty easy. It should mostly be just review. So let's start with what our nutrients are in reviewing this. Nutrients are phosphorus and nitrogen. So we often refer to them as N and P, and they are in the forms of phosphate most of the time and nitrate most of the time. And this is because they are fertilizers that we find in agriculture and what we put on our lawns. But what happens with them is oftentimes they're over applied and then they wash off with runoff, which means rain falls, excess water kind of flows downhill in the watershed, and then we end up with those nutrients in nearby waterways. What then happens is what we call cultural eutrophication, which is really just anthropogenic eutrophication, meaning people caused it. And that eutrophication is the algae overgrowth we've discussed in the past. So we are going to talk about the steps of that in just a minute, and those steps are essential to remember. All right, so what is eutrophication then? And again, this is a big deal for the AP Environmental Science exam, so if nothing else, make sure you put a big giant star next to that steps of eutrophication section right there where I've got the bullet points that start with algae increases due to increase in N and P. So circle, star, highlight, do something. So for eutrophication, again, it's coming from people and it's coming from mainly fertilizers, things like nitrates and phosphates. So usually what will happen is, again, we overapply these for agriculture or to our lawns to make it grow nice and green and pretty, and excess gets washed into waterways. You can also find nitrogen in sources such as animal waste or even sewage discharge, because human waste and animal waste is going to contain quite a bit of nitrogen as well. Phosphates, though, they are usually found in fertilizers or due to phosphate mining, and we mine phosphates mainly because we want them for fertilizers. So now that we know what those chemicals are, let's take a look at then what happens to them once they get into the environment. So let's look at the steps of eutrophication. And this, again, is essential. You must know it. So what will happen first is algae is going to increase due to excess nitrogen and phosphorus, or nitrates and phosphates, in the water. Basically, those are limiting nutrients for plants and plant-like organisms like algae. And so what will happen is the algae blooms or grows a lot because they have plenty of food, basically. Light is then blocked because of their growth, and that makes it difficult for plants in the water to continue doing photosynthesis. And things that are photosynthesizing are usually the base of the food chain, so that's going to affect everything alive in the water. The next thing that happens is not just that sunlight block, but the oxygen in the water is going to start to decrease over time. And this is because the algae is going to die and decompose, and it's going to do this at a huge level because there's so much of it. So they use up the oxygen during their decomposition process, and when that oxygen in the water, so the dissolved oxygen that like fish breathe, for example, is lowered, this is going to lead to fish and plant die-offs. We call that lower oxygen concentration in the water hypoxia, and that is, again, a term you definitely want to know. So when you're writing FRQs about stuff like this, using those good solid vocab terms like nutrients, hypoxia, lower oxygen concentration, phrasing like that is going to be beneficial for you earning points. All right, the last thing that'll end up happening is that decaying organisms like algae or other things that die can end up producing toxins in the water, and that can be harmful as well. That's kind of a minor thing, though. Really, the bottom line is the algae decomposing uses oxygen, creates hypoxia, and then everything in the waterway is at risk. So there's also kind of a common everyday name for these hypoxic regions. We call them dead zones, and they're areas where hypoxia has gotten so bad that the organisms in the area either no longer live there, they've moved away from it because they can't breathe, or everything that was in that region has died. And these often occur near the ocean bottom or near coastal waterways where there is a watershed that all flows to the same river and then maybe all dumps out into the same place in the ocean. For example, the Mississippi, we're going to look at in just a minute. It's a massive watershed. It picks up a lot of fertilizer pollution because it runs right up the middle part of the United States where a lot of our agriculture is. And then all that excess fertilizer gets washed right into the same place at the Mississippi River Delta in the Gulf of Mexico. And so we end up with a regular hypoxic or dead zone forming. Chesapeake Bay is another famous example of this. This is in Maryland, and it's the exact same cause. It has a lot of farmland around it, a lot of CAFOs, a lot of chicken and pig farming that goes on in those CAFOs, and so you get a lot of waste and a lot of nutrients washed into that waterway. So let's take a look at the Gulf of Mexico dead zone a little bit more. First of all, look at that bottom left picture that shows the map of the United States. That lighter area with the blue kind of squiggly line going up through it, that is the Mississippi and the Mississippi watershed. Notice it looks like about 2/3 of the entire country. So that means all of those areas of farmland, all of those areas of impervious surfaces in cities, all of that waste, those nutrients, anything excess that gets picked up in runoff, all moves into that watershed and eventually can make its way to the Mississippi. It doesn't mean that every last little bit of fertilizer makes its way there, but a lot of it will end up concentrating in that river. Then we see it empty into the Gulf of Mexico. So look at the picture on the right. This is showing the formation of one of the dead zones. They tend to happen often in the summer in the Mississippi, and they kind of form and they dissipate a little bit and then form again later. But those hypoxic conditions left a massive over 5,000 square mile area of very, very low oxygen levels. This can be a huge problem for life in that area, and the Gulf of Mexico is used a lot for fishing, for food sources for people. So you can imagine if there's this much dead zone, there may also be problems with fishing in that area as well. So that hypoxia has wide-reaching implications for the environment, for organisms that live there, but also potentially for humans, and it was caused by us to begin with. One of the ways that we can measure the extent of the oxygen loss or hypoxia that occurs in the water is known as biological oxygen demand. It's basically the amount of oxygen that water and all the living things in it uses over a specific period of time. So we're looking at how fast that oxygen is consumed by the organisms in the water or by like decaying processes, for example, in the water, such as with eutrophication. So there's two types of biological oxygen demand. There's lower and higher. When we see lower BOD, what that means is a water body is actually less polluted. When the oxygen demand is lower, you don't have generally hypoxic situations taking place. The oxygen's not being used up rapidly. It's just being used at kind of a more normal level. Whereas if we run these tests and we come back with a higher BOD, it means the water is likely more polluted, the oxygen is being used up much faster, and microorganisms have a chance of having hypoxia take place due to their just general biological reactions. So we can actually illustrate this with something called an oxygen sag curve. So let's take a look at this on the next slide. All right, let's take a look at what that sag curve looks like. So the oxygen sag curve is actually a graph, and what it is doing is showing you how the biological oxygen demand, or BOD, changes over time as you move downstream on a river. So what we'll see is that BOD is going to be highest at the point of just discharge of the pollutant. So like let's say we have some effluent, which is the name of liquid discharge, from like an industrial facility that contains a lot of nutrients. So that is our discharge point right here at the start of the graph. And you can see on the y-axis we have BOD and dissolved oxygen. What we'll see is that our dissolved oxygen concentration is actually this red line here. So notice it's actually high right at the point of discharge and then immediately is dropping off. And that is showing you that the oxygen is declining because the biological oxygen demand, the BOD, is high, and that's your blue line. All right, so we can see our BOD is high, our oxygen demand, our dissolved oxygen is actually declining. And then as we move further down the river, we can see that our BOD then starts to decline. Basically, the pollutant is becoming diluted, and that means that the oxygen demand is not going to be as high. And then you can see your dissolved oxygen starts to come back up, and our BOD again is down. So the further away you get down the river, so moving left to right, we see that biological oxygen demand decline, and then our dissolved oxygen go back up. So bottom line is if there's a lot of pollutants, there's not going to be a lot of oxygen. As the pollutants drop off, the oxygen returns. All right, let's move on to our next topic when it comes to water pollution, and that is biomagnification and bioaccumulation, two things we've also seen before. It's just been quite a while. So what bioaccumulation is the absorption of a type of chemical into the tissues of a living organism. So we often find these chemicals are fat soluble, meaning they get stored in the fats of organisms. Fat is actually for long-term storage within the body. So what we see is then what's in the fat stays in the fat because the fat's not going anywhere. So like, let's say you have an ocean mammal that has ended up eating quite a few tuna or other high-level predator fish. They contain a lot of mercury or maybe another known to bioaccumulate material in the fats of that fish. Well, then once that mammal takes that in, they are going to hold on to that chemical within their fat as well because it's fat soluble and fat's used for storage, and marine mammals tend to have a lot of fat. They have blubber on them. So what ends up happening over time is as those toxins accumulate in the tissues, we actually see biomagnification up the food chain. So you may have a little bit of mercury, for example, in the environment, in the water. That ends up in smaller fish. As smaller fish are eaten by larger fish, they take in more and more of that substance. As those are eaten by predatory fish, they get more and more of that substance in their system all the way up through the food chain. So what we'll see is top-level predators usually will have the highest concentration of these substances in their body, and that can lead to a lot of potentially deadly situations. For example, DDT was a pesticide used for mosquitoes back in the mid-1900s, and it was quickly discovered that it was causing eggshell thinning in predatory birds. So pelicans, other water birds like osprey, eagles, their eggshells were thinning so badly they could barely reproduce. The babies were not actually supported by the egg. When the mom went to incubate them, the egg would get smushed. So we actually saw eagles in the United States become endangered because of this. Another chemical that's known to bioaccumulate and magnify is PCBs. And this is a long-term toxin, meaning it lasts for a very, very long time in the environment. We're going to talk about POPs, or persistent organic pollutants, in just a minute. PCBs is a chemical from that group, and it's, again, totally from people. Whereas mercury is often from coal burning, so caused by us, but it's a naturally occurring substances. PCBs is created by people. So let's talk a little bit more about mercury, since I mentioned that on the previous slide as a chemical that both bioaccumulates and then magnifies up the food chain. It is naturally occurring, but is being contributed by people due to our fossil fuel combustion, mainly of coal. There's not a way to remove it. It's just naturally occurring within coal, and so mercury ends up building up in the environment over time because of that. So we will see mercury bioaccumulate, load its way up through the top of the food chain very quickly, and we get our top level predators with high levels of mercury, which is neurotoxic. So it's not very good for their health at all. Now, the form of mercury we're actually dealing with, you should know, and it's called methylmercury. And it's actually more toxic because there are bacteria in the environment that actually process the mercury in a way that makes it more toxic, unfortunately. So it's kind of a twofold problem. Not only are we releasing it as people through our fossil fuel use, but in the environment it becomes even more dangerous. And it's actually harder for organisms to clear methylmercury from their body, so it bioaccumulates much faster and much worse. This image here kind of illustrates what happens with mercury. You can see the sources up at the top of the picture, but the key thing is really looking at the food chain. So starting with the krill on the right side, you can see that they have been exposed to mercury within the water in the environment, and they'll have a small amount. The problem is what eats the krill doesn't just eat one or two krill. They'll eat a couple of krill a day, or a lot of krill a day, depending on what their diet is like, and they're taking in mercury for every single krill they consume. Then let's say the yellowfish, like trout and tuna, then end up eating something like the salmon, pollock, or oyster. They're not just going to eat one, they eat many, so multiply that amount of mercury again. And then you can see our top level consumers, our shark, our pike, albacore, or halibut, they are going to have the same problem. As they eat the things lower in the food chain, their level of mercury is going to increase as well. So not only are these organisms bioaccumulating mercury in their own individual bodies, it is biomagnifying up the food chain. And if you look at the bottom of this picture, notice it says eat only a few times per week or a few times per month. That's actually human guidelines. So for example, you should not be eating large top-level consumer fish like halibut or swordfish very often because of the higher levels of mercury. It would be safer to eat lower on the food chain because there would be less mercury in those animals. Let's take a look at the next type of pollutant that can also bioaccumulate within the environment. These are known as POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. Their big problem is they just don't break down. So this is going to be the category that DDT falls into. PCBs, as I mentioned before, and other pesticides. They get into the environment, they're made by people, and they just don't go anywhere. They work very much like mercury does. They're soluble in fats, and so they can end up building up in organisms or bioaccumulating over time. And then they just become deadly at that point because they're toxic to those organisms. And the other very dangerous thing with them is they're very easy to move around. So you can see like the picture in the top right of the crop duster. If you're using something like DDT and you're dusting it over crops, wind and water can very quickly pick that up and redeposit it elsewhere. So it's not just an issue of, oh, it's just, my farm that's being affected. Other farms could be affected as well, or other land masses. Just think of watersheds with runoff. There's a lot of ways that these toxins could move. And so you're endangering a widespread area by using them. Our next couple of topics are also review from earlier this year. We discussed thermal pollution back when we talked about nuclear power plants and coal-fired power plants, because both these types of power plants are going to use cooling towers to cool off the steam that they use to generate electricity. So if you think back to Unit 6 with our different types of power production, we talked about the fact that we use something hot, so such as burning coal or the nuclear power from the fission reactions that take place to boil water. We then use that water to spin a turbine. That turbine is then connected to a generator to create electricity. Well, then we've got a lot of steam that we need to deal with, and those go into cooling towers that are giant and allow that steam to cool back down into liquid water. The problem is that water is often hotter than the outdoor temperature surrounding wherever that power plant is. So let's say you have a power plant on a waterway, which they often are due to the need for water. You end up having that boiling water cool down, but maybe not back to the outdoor temperature. Let's say it's winter and it's a lot colder. Having to cool it all the way down would use even more energy to do that. So we often end up releasing warmer water than what is in the environment out into waterways. The problem with that is organisms often don't like it and may be out of their range of tolerance, but we also see some issues with water and its ability to hold oxygen. Higher temperature water actually does not hold oxygen very well, so when we release it into a waterway, that is going to lower the dissolved oxygen in the water. That could be a problem for organisms if they are organisms that have a high demand for oxygen. Cold water is actually going to hold more oxygen, so now you're mixing potentially cold external water from the building with hot water that you're releasing, further lowering the oxygen altogether. And that pollution may even prevent fish from coming near that area at all. If it's widespread, it could even prevent migration up a waterway. So let's take a look at visually what that looks like. So you guys have seen this image before. I showed this to you back with nuclear power plants. We took a look at the fact that the power plant is actually the orange and red kind of rectangle on land, and then you can see the warm water exiting from that plant. That is all from the cooling towers. And notice how widespread that plume of warm water is up that waterway. So that means there is a pretty large area that is affected by this change in temperature. That means not only organisms may be avoiding it, but the oxygen in that water is also going to be lower as well. Our last topic for aquatic pollution is going to be taking a look at wetlands again. We talked about these earlier this year, but we need to go into some detail on how they function in the environment. So generally, wetlands kind of act as sponges for water ecosystems. So you may have a river or a lake with wetlands surrounding them, and they are areas that generally have saturated soils, meaning the soil is full of water, but they often can take on more water. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're below water themselves. They just have very wet soils and very particular plants that live there. Wetland species are often what we consider obligate wetland species. They can handle the fact that the soil is saturated with water, which affects the amount of oxygen around their roots. So again, it's a very particular environment, very particular organisms. The reason these are beneficial is, and this is the part you want to remember, so put a star by it, they may provide many services to the ecosystem that end up ultimately benefiting people. Things like water purification. So if there's runoff, wetlands can help absorb and filter out toxins. Flood protection. So because they take in excess water from waterways, let's say it's spring and there's a snowmelt and that river level is risen, wetlands help absorb that extra water. Water filtration and habitat as well. There are many species that use wetlands as breeding grounds or as areas where they feed, so they're essential habitats to those organisms. Some wetlands also have very unique plants, such as mangroves, that are found around coastlines, and they help prevent erosion, as do wetlands around waterways. So threats to wetlands are things that we need to avoid, but unfortunately, they are widespread. Commercial development's probably the worst. It's just humans using land that has wetlands on it for development. Wetlands end up being filled in, built on top of, and then they're not wetlands anymore. They can't help with the things like water purification and flood protection. Dam construction, which creates a reservoir that expands a river behind the dam, is going to destroy any wetlands that surrounded that river. Overfishing, wetlands can be submerged underwater and they can have fish in them. Some fish even use them as fish nurseries. So you have that potential population impact. And then eutrophication, which in Florida is one of the worst problems we have with our wetlands. We have a massive wetland ecosystem known as the Everglades in South Florida, but there happens to be an agricultural area known as the Everglades Agricultural Area, or EAA, right above it. So a lot of nutrients get washed into the waterways of the Everglades, and they have been dealing with loads of eutrophication for ages. And there's currently a multi-billion-dollar project that's been underway for more than a decade trying to help that ecosystem recover. So let's go ahead and take a look at how wetlands actually protect water bodies. So notice that there is a stream in this picture, and then we have a wetland area, which is the big center part of the picture right here. So this one's showing that it's actually partially underwater. It would be very shallow. There would often be what we call emergent plants. They're plants that are rooted in the kind of wet soil under the wetland, but emerge out of the water. If there's standing water there, it doesn't necessarily have to be there. But look at all of the different things that happens here. We have the contaminants and sediments are filtered, so they're picked up by the wetland before they get to the stream. What's cool about wetlands is a lot of the plants actually help filter out a lot of this stuff, including nutrients. So we will actually see cleaner water outflow from the wetlands. They help pull a lot of the nitrogen and phosphorus, especially plants like cattails. They're fantastic at this, out of any runoff before it makes it to the actual waterway down to the right there. Habitat for wildlife, breakdown of contaminants by bacteria is potential, and there is a potential benefit in this case. You can see the groundwater flow here as well. So there's water actually moving underground into that wetland, as well as surface water that we see moving into that wetland. And then notice this says dissipate stream energy. So if there is a lot of runoff, it's actually slowing down the movement of that into the stream. And that is helping prevent erosion and protecting the sides of that stream itself. So wetlands do a vital job in protecting large waterways like lakes, rivers, and streams. Wetlands are in fact so useful that humans have figured out how to utilize their beneficial properties for helping to recover an ecosystem that is struggling. So for example, in the Everglades, constructed wetlands have been put in place to help clean up polluted water that has excess amounts of fertilizer nutrients in them. So what we do is we literally build a wetland and we populate it with plants such as cattails, rushes, and other water plants that root down beneath the water and then grow up out of the water to help absorb those excess nutrients. So you can see in these pictures here, there's some engineering involved. You can see there's like a wastewater inlet and an outlet in the top picture. Macrophytes would be those wetland plants that help absorb those nutrients. And literally what we do is we send polluted water that may contain more nutrients than should be moving into, like the Everglades in this case. And then that water is cleaned up by those plants. So the plants literally take up the extra nitrogen and phosphorus. That water then is going to be less likely to suffer from eutrophication downstream into the Everglades. This last image is something we've also talked about previously, which is how mangroves protect coastal areas as well. If you look at that top picture, earlier this year I showed you guys a video of a mangrove tank. It was an artificial tank set up where there was a beach on one end, mangroves, and then a wave machine. So if you look at the top picture, you can see the waves moving from left to right. The mangroves are blocking the coastline and it's slowing down that wave energy. It's basically protecting the shoreline from the ocean as energy. If you look at the bottom one, notice there's no mangroves. So mangroves are an essential wetland plant because a lot of the surrounding coastal areas may either be somewhat in the water or kind of inland just slightly, and that mangrove that grows there helps protect from any excess energy from the ocean, especially in times of hurricane where we can have storm surge. This is very, very valuable for protecting coastal land. So you could, for example, on an FRQ be given a question that says something like, describe an economic benefit of protecting mangroves near coastlines. And you could describe the fact that mangroves slow down wave energy, prevent coastal flooding, which in turn protects property on the beach. Because property is valuable, we end up protecting our property from damage that could occur. We end up protecting it from financial impact. Because remember, if you see economic on the exam, what we're looking for is something money-based. Protecting property would be money-based. All right, guys, that is the second part of the aquatic ecosystems pollution notes that we will be dealing with Unit 8. So please make sure you've got all your blanks filled in, back up through the slides if you need to, and then we'll be moving on to the next section of notes for Unit 8 soon.